Welcome. We are so pleased you're able to join us today for this webinar on the work of the Linked Conservation Data Consortium over the past year. My name is Kristen St. John. I'm Head of Conservation Services for the Stanford Libraries. Athanasios Velios, who is the principal investigator of our grant and a reader in documentation at the University of the Arts London, and I will be the main host this morning, along with several guest speakers to come. So let's begin. Today, we'll start with a brief overview of linked data and its potential utility for conservation documentation. Then we'll go over our activities of the past year that we have accomplished with funding from the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council. We'll discuss two major areas in linked data, terminology and modeling. Much of our work this past year has been spent investigating these topics as they relate to our data, our documentation. Through these explorations, we've identified specific areas of need and potential. We'll wrap up by sharing these and our upcoming plans to address them. Thanasis, over to you.
Okay, I would like to start with some questions that at the moment is a little bit difficult to answer in conservation. In some cases, it's almost impossible. And I've got a few examples here. So the first one is, say you're working on or you're treating an object that you haven't treated before, and it's a strange object. One is not sure what aspects of it should be original or not. It will be useful to be able to find out from other people more information about it. The second point is about the correlation of condition survey results with evaluating the environment that we have in our stores, in our studios. This is something that is rarely done and really should be done on a regular basis. The third point is an example of everyday question where you get a new material recommended to you, but you don't know if other people have used it in the past and what their experience with it was. So finding reviews about these things is difficult. Which objects worked for and which objects were difficult to work for, and so on. The last example, the last point I've got here is about identifying trends in conservation, and questions like, did we really work only on surface cleaning for the past year for exhibitions in my organization? And if we did that, then what was the impact of the collection? Was there any impact? So the reason why it is difficult to answer these questions at the moment is because the answers are held in data from separate systems. And almost as a rule, these systems do not talk to each other. They're incompatible. That means that if I'm doing some work that requires gathering information from multiple resources, so that maybe I need to have a representative sample, that's a very difficult thing to do. People might know that I have some interest in historical books. So if I was to collect information, observations from conservators across the world from different libraries, it would have been a very difficult task indeed. So the whole point of the Linked Conservation Data Project is to allow conservators to share and communicate their records efficiently. So Kristen and I have a problem. So I use the word N-band in my database, and Kristen uses the word headband in the databases in Stanford. And of course, we want to carry on using our own words because we are used to them, but we also want to be able to search each other's databases. And of course, we are certain that this is possible because we're talking about the same thing. We have established that. And what we're talking about is what you can see in the little photo at the top. It's the idea of the N-band. And this is the point where thesauri become very useful. For example, the art and architecture thesaurus from the Getty, they have an entry describing what headbands are. And therefore, what we could both do is simply point to that entry and carry on using our local labels, our local words, but make sure that we point to the same concept, universal concept as defined in the art and architecture thesaurus. So this idea of having something abstract that I can point to turns out to be a very useful thing. For databases, say I've got a number of databases here describing books or components of books. I want to find really the same or a similar abstract entity that will allow me to link, to bridge across all of these fields and databases. And the question is, of course, where do I get this abstract entity from? And in conservation, we're lucky because over many years, there has been quite a lot of work in defining these abstract entities. And we're able to use abstract entities as defined by what we call the CDOC CRM ontology. So in this case, in my database that holds books or components of books, I can say that I can bridge across my databases through the abstract entity of E22 human-made object. This is another example. So I've got a book cover of my manuscript on one side, and I've got the decoration on the specific cover for the same manuscript. And I can say that one of them is the E22 human man-made object, as the definition exists in the CDOC CRM, and the tool decoration is the E25 human-made feature. The middle bit is actually quite important because this is the point where I can connect the specific cover with the specific decoration. And again, the CDOC CRM allows us to make these connections, provides all the relationships, we call them properties, between the different entities. And in this case, we use something called the P56 bears feature. The other thing to notice here is that this triple structure is developing. And in linked data, this is a very commonly used thing. In fact, we have a name for it. We call it the RDF, the Resource Description Framework. And it is really the backbone technology for linked data. Another important point for linked data is the universal resource identifiers. And you will remember that I mentioned the headbands earlier in my example. The Getty not only provides a definition for headbands, but also provides this little address at the top. And this is what makes pointing to the definition so easy. So I don't need to worry about words. I just need to include this entry in my database to point to that definition. And this is a very good solution because first of all, that address only points to one thing. So I'm not going to be confused with different things. The Getty has made a commitment to maintain this, this page and this link in the future. So my links in my own database will not break. And of course, it's relatively easily accessible if I have an internet connection. So it's actually a very useful thing, the URI. And we believe that by solving the bridge or building the bridge for terminology and building the bridges across the different databases, we will be able to allow to conservators to answer difficult questions and also improve their everyday work. Another important thing is, of course, that this will allow us to communicate the conservation records to the public and therefore increase accessibility. So this was a very quick introduction, just to say that that is the path we take to solve the conservation data puzzle. I would like to pass the screen now back to Kristen, and she will describe the activities that have taken place over the first year of the project.
Okay, so let's start with this next section and talk about our work over the past year. On our website, we have a list of the consortium members, and they range from conservators to conservation scientists to academics to people who work with technology and data in and for cultural heritage institutions. So this list has continued to grow from our first group, and I'll put a plug in here that we welcome new consortium members all the time. So with this grant, we decided to investigate the two key components that Thanasis just highlighted to implementing linked data: how to model conservation data using the CDOC CRM ontology, since it has been successfully used for other cultural heritage projects, and how to build the required terminology needed to express our work. We also built a website for information sharing. We decided our main ways to explore these ideas would be through these activities here listed on the screen, through public webinars, 2 in-person meetings, also that are kind of workshop-y, and we also committed to producing reports and a wrap-up webinar. So for our first webinar, our goal was to introduce the concepts of linked data to a broad audience and show how it would be useful to conservators and conservation professionals. We asked people from 3 areas to look at either challenges and opportunities for linked data or to demonstrate how it was already in use in cultural heritage projects. You can see the list of speakers here, and in fact, you can watch the webinar on our website. We had both strong registration and attendance. It was far higher than we expected. So we were very pleased with that outcome. Next, we began to plan our in-person meetings and workshops. We knew our first meeting would be on terminology. In order to get a better grasp of what terminology or vocabulary resources people rely on, we distributed a short questionnaire. And based on the results from this and other research we did, we built a list of vocabularies that can be found on our website. So when we first met to discuss terminology, it was in June at Stanford. And here's a list of the speakers we brought together. Talks from our presenters focused on how terminology is used in linked data, as well as looking at different tools and resources available to assist. We also met in groups to assess the state of vocabularies, many of which had been previously identified through our survey, currently used by conservation professionals, and also to determine how well they cover the areas we need covered. As with the webinar, all of the presentations are available for viewing on our project website. Coming away from this workshop, we identified the following outcomes. We saw a need to encode some vocabularies to make them machine readable, although as noted previously, some resources, some of the best resources like the Getty vocabularies are already available, many are not. We decided there was a need to provide a way to match terms and also to find a strategy to publish our own terms and vocabularies suitable for documentation that we ourselves generate. In September, we met in London for our second meeting on modeling this time. As with the first meeting, it was a combination of presentations as well as group work. In the mornings, we heard lectures introducing the CDOC CRM ontology and saw how it's used in several projects. In the afternoons, we practiced modeling data in 4 different groups. The data had been submitted in advance by several consortium members, and it ranged from simple database entries to checkbox forms to scientific spectra to long-form narrative treatment reports. We tried to model a wide array of information. On the second day, we also had lightning talks from several participants about their conservation documentation and projects they have going surrounding conservation documentation. Again, as before, all of the talks are available on our project website. Our outcomes from this workshop include the following points. We think we gained valuable experience with real test case studies, modeling against the CDOC CRM. We came to consider several modeling challenges, and we're going to discuss that in a little bit to come. And we decided we need to be able to deliver modeling guidelines so we can share expertise and also begin work on pilots. Finally, Thanasis has been able to do a series of mini modeling workshops in the past few months throughout the UK, and we're actually planning to hold another full modeling workshop in the US this upcoming fall.
Okay, so I'm just picking up from the outputs that Kristen explained a minute ago from the terminology workshop. So it doesn't matter if you cannot read the fine print. This is all on the website, so you can easily look it up. And I wasn't planning to go through it all anyway. But the first task, like Kristen mentioned, was that we need to encode many of the vocabularies in conservation which are basically either in print form or in text documents. So they're not in databases or spreadsheets that can be easily accessed with a piece of software. The point you will notice in this, so we've created this flow chart, and this is designed for conservators who maintain vocabularies in conservation, and it sort of organizes a workflow that one needs to follow in order to take the vocabulary and make it machine readable. You will notice that the idea of the URI features prominently over here. If the vocabularies, and many of them do not have URIs, so if they do not have URIs, we will need to produce them. So there's a discussion to be had about how to produce the URIs and what they will look like. So this we hope we will be able to do in the next phase. And you will also notice that this acronym SCORS appears everywhere, and SCORS is a standard that allows us to encode vocabularies, and it basically does what I brought up in the example earlier on. It separates the labels, the words that we use, from the concepts, the ideas that these words describe. So by following this workflow, we can get to the point over here in the end where we're meant to share the encoded vocabulary. Again, ideally, we would have some sort of website to be able to share the stuff in addition to the machine readable format. But if the website is not easy to produce, then we can get around that problem. Again, we can discuss later. The next point that came out from the workshop as a task that we need to follow is this idea of matching terms, so that we are able to continue using our own terminologies, but be able to search other people's records. Yeah, and again, we produced a separate flow chart that allows us to, or will allow us to do that. And you will notice that the first question over here has to do, is about hierarchies. People who have worked with vocabularies in the past will know that it is possible to organize terminology in a hierarchical fashion. And so the question of whether it is worth matching a whole hierarchy as opposed to an individual term comes quite early in the process. If one vocabulary goes into a lot of detail in one area, then perhaps there's no point matching terms that do not exist in other vocabularies. Maybe you want to match a whole hierarchy. And this goes out to the two processes about the BPT thesaurus over here. Now, this is the point where I would like to pass the screen to Eleni Tsouloucha from Forth. Forth has developed tools to allow hierarchical matching of thesauri, and Eleni can explain a little bit more about that.
Okay, so let me say that I have not prepared the PowerPoint presentation because I kind of wanted to show you what the visual terminology alignment tool does, what it can do, like online. So instead of just showing you screenshots of what I have done previously. But before I do that, I mean, there's like a lot of people here who have probably never heard of the visual terminology alignment tool. It's a way to actually map one terminology to another, and it assists users do that in like manually, but it actually shows you what you're aligning to what. It helps you work on the intellectual handling of the alignment between two terminologies. And the only relationship that it actually that it is based on is the broader match and broader narrow relation, so broader match, and the exact match. It doesn't deal with an exact match because then the results are not exactly queryable, and the idea then is that we actually have to work with small to medium-sized terminologies, because it's very much, it's a huge load. It's very cumbersome to actually align terminologies that are huge if you're not familiar with both the source and the target. To say one more thing about that, it's actually that the output of this terminology alignment is a subordination of a source to a target. So in the end, you get the union of the target plus the aligned terms and their children as the output. So it's actually very easy tool to use, which is why I wanted to show you like a hands-on thing. First, it only has like two tabs. One is the import-export tab, and the other one is the one where you edit the terminology. You can drag and drop the RDF files exactly here, and then you can create a new alignment. I'm just going to create one because I would like to show you how it's done. Let me just, sorry about that. Let me just do this, sorry. What should happen now? So you can basically drag and drop, and then it just goes on for a bit. Okay. And I'm going to, okay, and then we can create a new alignment if we want to. I'm going to choose the lob, and as a target, I'm going to use the BBT because it's actually quite a small one and it works pretty fine. And so we have like some tabs here that you can see. Let me show them to you quickly. Here you can search within the terminologies of the source and the target. Sorry, not this one, this one. And here you can start by expanding the hierarchies of the source and the target in order to link what seems to be matching. So we should start at the top of the list in order to quickly demonstrate that. We have this hierarchy in the book-binding thesaurus that's called actors. Usually, well, I mean, from what we can see here is just professional nouns. So knowing what the BBT does, how the BBT treats professional nouns, it's actually professional, well, yeah, professional groups. I know what it does is treat actors as abstractions over a B14 carried out by actor. So when I click, that thing is done by roles. When I click on the I here, I get, I go to a new tab that says view roles, and then this shows me what I want to see. The scope note in the BBT, the term that classifies attitudes and social behaviors and direct speech of a person, and so on and so forth. I also get the translations in Greek, German, and French because they're updated. And then I just drag and drop. And then I'm asked, are actors an exact match or a narrower match to roles? Well, roles are not only professional, so it should be a narrower term. I'm just selecting this one. And then I get the full hierarchy I subsume under the target terminology. I can go on and do that with more examples, but I'm not going to. What is an interesting case. Oh, sorry, again, I could, by looking at this screen, I mean, I can give a different name to the label, to the alignment graph, because all this thing, HTTP fourth, GR alignment, log BBT official, blah, 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 does not really make sense. So I could say online test. And then I would actually have this particular representation. If I wanted to, what is interesting is that actually the system will not allow me to make mistakes. If for some reason, I'm just going to do a random mapping at this point, it doesn't really make sense. But if for some reason I were to map a subclass, a sub-hierarchy of features to my physical features, and then as an exact match, and then I were to pick up the entire branch from the log and say it's actually a narrower term, I would get, I did get that, I would get something, I would get I would get an issue, something that says that maybe, I mean, I haven't done that right. And I actually did this very fast and you missed it probably. So let me just do it again. Sorry about that. So if I do this, and say it's an exact match. So yeah, I mean, this was the warning that I wanted to show you. It says that the source term features contains already aligned descendants. This would create a cyclic graph, which is something I wouldn't want to get. So it kind of, this is not the case, but when you get multiple, when you have like a very complex source and very complex targets, it is possible that you actually end up making mistakes and you don't want to do that. Also, you can select and deselect things that should not be mapped. I mean, if I actually go to symbolic objects and I want to map it to the symbolic objects of BBT, for instance, if I find it, it's conceptual, there you go. So, and I want to map it to the symbolic objects of BBT, and then under annotations, sorry, under bibliographical information, I get authors, and I don't want to get authors mapped to the symbolic objects because I think that it's a professional group and I shouldn't be doing that. I just deselect it. And then once I make the connection, which is declared as an exact match, I actually have left out the thing that is not compatible and is not, that should not be aligned with my target at this stage. So this is, it's just something that is easy and nice, and it can help you align terminology so that you can figure out what, you know, differences of terminology, or even, you know, to aggregate many terminologies under one. And you can always take a look at the result of this alignment in the form of a graph. So now I've actually only aligned two things, and you get this particular alignment, so symbolic objects. And you can also get the statistics for the alignment that is available. So you get the inherited relations. This would be the broader. You would get who created it. So this will actually usually be one person, or the people that have created the alignments if there more than one. And then you get the broader match and the exact match. If we go back to the previous screen, by clicking on this button, you can see what the non-aligned terms are, and then they'll be marked by green. And if we were to edit the page, I'm not going to because this is not me. We could go and edit the queries that return the graphical representation and I mean what is shown on the page. So
that is great. Thank you very much, Eleni. This really shows exactly how the tool works, and it's indeed just a matter of drag and drop operation. So domain experts and not computer scientists can use the system to align vocabularies. So thank you very much for that. So basically, Eleni explained this part of the flowchart over here. So the next question we've got is to figure out really whether we want to match our vocabulary to or our thesaurus to a single thesaurus. Say, for example, I'm working in historical bookbinding, and therefore, for some reason, I'm only interested in the language of binding thesaurus and the RBMS thesaurus. Or if I want to match my thesaurus with something like the Getty AAT, which is, has a much wider scope, and we can call the Getty AAT a hub thesaurus. Yeah, and for linked conservation data, we have decided that it is a good idea to always match with the Getty first, and then carry on matching with other thesauri. So at this stage, I would like to invite John Ward from the Getty to show us a couple of tools that allow matching terms with terminology in the Getty, but also to submit new terms that maybe the Getty Arts and Architectural Thesaurus doesn't have already.
Okay, you know what, I have to say at the Getty, just in the past 2 weeks, we all received a new slide deck template that everyone now has to use. This is the first time I've used it. It looks, you know, there's sort of very strict rules, and we must follow this particular template for all of our new presentations. This is the first one that I've given. So it's probably not particularly imaginative on my part in terms of design. So I'll work on that in the next one. So this will be a very sort of simplified overview of the process for contributing to the Art and Architecture Thesaurus, as well as a brief rundown on how to reconcile data with the vocabularies using our new OpenRefine service. So to contribute terms to the AAT, there are really 3 basic criteria for anyone. First, you must be an authorized contributor, which is a very simplified way to say that you have an agreement with us, whether you're an institution, a consortium, a scholar. The terms you provide must be within the scope of the AAT. The scope is actually very broad. Variant terms must be true synonyms, and they must fall in a true parent-child thesaurus relationship within the hierarchy. We try to avoid things like compound terms, if you've heard that before. A very simple example would be blue chair, an example of being 2 bound individual terms that you know, shouldn't be connected. But there actually are many contributors who do need certain compound terms. So we're trying to be as flexible as we can for adding terms to the vocabularies. And the contribution must contain the minimum required information, and those required fields are the preferred term, usually accompanied by 3 scholarly sources to indicate that it's, you know, most widely used in the field. Variant terms, if applicable, only 1 source needed for variant terms. The term's hierarchical positions in the AAT, that's very important. The language of the term. AAT is multilingual. We have lots of translations going on right now, which is really interesting. You know, these are slow, long-term projects, obviously, but it's happening. And sources, as I mentioned, and a descriptive note, or what they call a scope note. This is again for new terms. If you'd like to contribute data to terms that already exist, which many people do, the process is different and much simpler. We certainly accept that. Some institutions simply want to add the fact that they too prefer a certain term over a variant term, for example. The process usually begins on the contributor's end by analyzing and comparing their data against the full AAT to find matches. Those missing terms can be new contributions, as we were just mentioning. You can contact us at email, at the vocab@getty.edu to kind of start the process going if you haven't already been in touch with us before. Discuss your preferred delivery format, discuss terminology issues you have, things like that. We usually prefer to see a sample of your data to make sure we can work with it. For terms in bulk, let's say hundreds of terms or thousands, we usually prefer XML format. However, we very frequently work with Excel if you have to, and if anyone needs precise detail on any field in AAT, the parameters, or the contribution process in general, the website gets into great detail about that. I've listed the address here specifically for the AAT guidelines. We generally update our online data once a month, and a lot can happen actually in AAT in a month. It's not super common to have huge bulk data loads into AAT, but for example, we just added about 15,000 French terms to the AAT from the Canadian Heritage Information Network. That's a really interesting process. I'd love to talk about that more, but I don't have time. To help reconcile and align bulk data to the vocabularies, our technical team created an OpenRefine service, which is just now available. OpenRefine is an open source software that some of you might be familiar with. Once installed, it runs in a browser. At first glance, it kind of looks like a more advanced Excel, but it's much easier to work with for large-scale data cleanup and for really advanced changes to the data. You can use a pretty easy expression language called GREL, which is General Refined Expression Language, to perform advanced fixes and things like that. But I'll show a couple screenshots. Most importantly, though, it has a means to reconcile your data through a service. And we created our own service to reconcile your own terminologies against the vocabularies. Though you could reconcile against other services, of course, like Wikidata or VOF or something like that. We have a tutorial online with this with much more detail than I'm able to provide now, but I'll just very quickly show you how this is done. You install the software. This is the first screen you see when you have OpenRefine open. The exe file running in the background and the interface to import or create a project. You can import an Excel file, XML, CSV, a JSON file, number of options. As an example, I opened a very large ULAN contribution. I didn't have a huge AAT contribution example since this is so new, but we can work with this and you'll see what I mean. On the left-hand side panel, you can keep track of your work and undo or redo anything you've worked on. And the large panel is your fielded data. In this case, it's artists' data, including names, dates, nationality, biographies, etc. Here, it's a quick snapshot showing you how you can clean data in bulk. Example, if you have date values in a column and you want to simply show the year to submit the year with us, we don't need an actual full date. Create a new column, write a simple GREL expression. It will show you the value as you transform the data. The date string becoming the year. Let's say you'd like to reconcile the ULAN column for nationality against the AAT. All nationality terms in ULAN, the Union List of Artist Names, are also terms in AAT. And you'd want to make sure they match before contributing. So you go to the column you want to reconcile, click Start Reconciling, and it lists services on the left. You can see one already there, VOF. But we want to add the Getty vocabulary service, which is the URL you can see typed that ends in the vocab /reconcile. Then hit Add Service. Here we can choose what vocabulary and what field we want to reconcile against the terms in our nationality field. In this case, we chose AAT and preferred name, or pref name. Again, all these details are explained clearly in our tutorial and in OpenRefine, actually. And we don't, in this case, want to auto match. See, I put a little arrow there, just kind of what Eleni said. Yeah, we don't want to do any auto matching. There's far too many homographs in our terminology thesauri. It's going to mess you up, especially with AAT. But let's give it a try. We'll start reconciling. The results will show you AAT terms that match the terms in the nationality field. And you can choose what matches either manually or otherwise. It pays to look very closely. See at the top, Icelandic culture style is what you'd want to choose at the top. That matches the nationality of in that nationality field of Icelandic. But under Chinese, you'll see the second term is what you'd want to match against. We're still working with how these results appear. We actually have made a lot of changes with that in the past couple of months. You do have the ability to limit your results, of course. This looks a little messy. You could, with a brief click, you could kind of limit the results to anything above 15%, for example. It makes it a lot easier to choose the proper results. The primary benefits of contributing are for quality, as our terms are vetted by institutions, contributed by institutions and scholars. For involvement, as you, the contributor, can enrich the data that needs it, and you receive credit for every term you provide, every piece of information you provide. And since it's linked open data, it has the potential to enrich other data sets as well. And that is it.
That's great. Thank you very much, John. I'll take over the screen once again. Yeah, so we're up here where John explained how we can submit missing terms to the AAT. And then for AAT, but also for matching terms across directly across two vocabularies, there are other ways of doing it. We have been very fortunate recently in that the team from the University of South Wales, Kerry Binding and Douglas Tadhope, have joined the consortium. And I would like to pass on the screen to Kerry now to describe another tool for aligning terms across vocabularies.
Yeah, this is VMT. This is a vocabulary matching tool that we created for the Ariadne Plus project. This is a European-wide project with a number of European partners where we're pulling together archaeological data sets and reports right across Europe and also from Japan and Argentina. And so what we wanted to do was to use the AAT as a hub vocabulary, as Thanasis has been describing earlier on. And so we've created this tool just as a simple way of the local data providers to demonstrate to us how their vocabularies match the AAT, how they would map to them. And so it's purposefully very simple tool where you can fill in your own terms. Say, I have a term here, it might have an identifier. If the identifier is a URI, you could put the URI in there, but they're not always. And then the interesting thing then is we're able to look up the AAT via the Sparkle endpoint. So we're always looking at the latest data, the latest information. So if I do a little lookup now, we've got a term of Abbey, and now we can search. I've already searched for it before. Okay, so we've got various things which have matched. It's been matching on preferred terms and alternate terms there. So we find a few alternatives, and what we can look at is some of the context around these concepts. We can see the scope note as I hover over the term there. We can compare the scope notes. We can see a little abbreviation of the hierarchical position of these things, so we can make a more informed choice then about what it is we're looking at. And if I click on each of the terms, then we can see its context in terms of the AAT information. You can see the full hierarchy. Yeah, see that's the full hierarchy for Abbey Church is there, and also multilingual terms that are involved with that concept. Okay, so we can make an informed choice about the match here. So we may choose this concept here, abbeys as monasteries, and we can say select that. And so then we've set up a match between our term of abbey and abbeys and monasteries. And here, as Analysis mentioned earlier on, the different types of matches. These are the SCOS matching relationships, and so we can choose one of these. There's a lot more information in the help. I'll just quickly bring up the help file. We've got help about what these match types mean in terms of semantic matching, and so you can choose the most appropriate one that suits your situation there. So yeah, and we can just keep adding rows and keep adding terms. So usually, though, you wouldn't be creating a vocabulary from scratch within the tool. You would have a vocabulary elsewhere, and you would just be interested in creating the mappings. And so if you had something that you prepared earlier, some sort of list, let me just copy that and bring up the tool again and see if I can paste those things in. Oh, I'm sorry, my copy and paste doesn't seem to be working through the video tool. You can copy and paste concepts in from an external source. So if I bring in some that I've already created, you'll be able to see a better idea of a completed set of mappings. Here's some concepts from elsewhere. We've come in, and we could do a similar process here of just suggesting terms from the AAT and creating the matches. We can then export the data to a JSON file. Yeah, just as simply exported to a very simple JSON format. There's no actual mappings in that set at the moment, so you can't see the AAT concepts that they've been mapped to. So that's a very, very simple tool to use. I'm trying to bring in something with a bit more information in it. Okay, so there's one with a few actual mappings involved in it. So you can see the types of match, and you can sort on the match types or on the identifiers or on the labels. And what we can also do is, because we have the URIs, in this instance, we have URIs from the source vocabulary and the target vocabulary there. And so we can actually look at the context of the terms themselves from the actual source vocabulary. We're not holding the vocabularies locally. We're just going out to that URI to have a look to see if we've got the correct context for that concept. Okay. So nothing in this tool would prevent creating some sort of invalid alignments. There's no rules, there's no built-in rules. As I said, we're not holding the underlying vocabularies. This tool is actually just working within your local browser. So you're free to go to this URI and try it yourselves. You won't break anything. You will just be holding the data locally. You will not be storing it elsewhere. And so it's quite a nice little tool to play around with if you want to try things out in more detail. And because we've had a lot of data partners in the Ariadne Plus project contributing mappings to us for submission to the Ariadne, we've got a lot of mappings with terms in multilingual terms that we'd be very interested in submitting these terms, feeding them back to the AAT. So I was very interested in John's previous talk about how to do that, because I think we've got a lot of stuff that maybe we may be able to supplement the AAT with. Okay, so we also have a facility to export to CSV format if you wanted to just quickly take the data out into a spreadsheet. Yeah, and so again, it's just a different version of that JSON data that we saw earlier, just a fielded set of information. Yeah. I didn't mention at the start, the tool itself is also multilingual. So we have a few different languages implemented already. So we're able to run it in different languages. Just for our use case, you know, we had obviously multilingual audience in the European project. And so we just added that capability as well. Yeah. And I'll put it back to English so I can understand what's going on here. Okay, so that's pretty much it. It's a very simple tool to use, and I encourage you to go to the URI and have a go at it. It's all open source, and it's the source code is available from my GitHub page, which is github.com/cbinding/vocabulary matching tool, I believe. So you're free to go and have a look at it there.
That's great. Maybe maybe you can type that in the chat as well.
Yes, I will do it, Thanasis.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that quick demonstration. So the third point, so we have a variety of tools that allow us to perform all this matching, and we can discuss those over the next phase of the project. But the last piece of work that needs to be done in relation to terminologies to obviously share and publish these vocabularies. And we've decided to use, or we're proposing to use anyway, an external, a third party repository to hold the data coming from matching and from the vocabularies. And the reason for that is that we don't want to burden the consortium long term with costs for maintaining repositories. So we're using resources from open online repositories to do that. The other point is that we wish to create some sort of website or an online system that will allow conservators to go and search and compare terminology from the different vocabularies. Now, this will have a cost because it will need to be hosted somewhere. And we will carry on trying to raise funding for a tool like that. But the idea is that if in the future the consortium is unable to cover the costs for a website, a user-friendly website, at least we're not going to lose the data. The website might go, but the data will still be in the repository and people can use it in a perhaps less friendly way. We can discuss maybe that at the questions time, but I'm a little bit aware of the time. So I would like to pass the screen again to Kristen, and she will talk about a couple of considerations in relation to modeling.
So all of that was a quick run through of different critical issues and technologies we need to develop for the vocabularies. As we are linking data, we need to be sure that our terminology is consistent, or at least we understand the variants that people are using in their documentation. So we also have been considering as the major work in this project modeling, which we talked about earlier. And I'm gonna bring us back to the afternoon sessions of our modeling workshops in London. So as I mentioned before, we split up into 4 groups, and we started actually modeling using CDocCRM. Documentation that people have provided. And I think that as we discussed modeling, certain themes came through. And one of those themes was that modeling is really fun. It's an interesting activity. It's like solving puzzles, creating data networks. It was just an enjoyable activity, but it was also a lot of work. And so I began to think about, and our group started to talk about, how far do we need to take this for making our data accessible in a meaningful way? So reflecting on this afterwards, I distilled some conversations down into 3 potential levels of sharing data, and I'd like to talk about those with you now. So a first level of sharing data would be a level 1, the kind of basic introductory level, where we create a pointer to conservation records that are not in machine readable format. This would include only basic information to indicate that conservation activity or assessment has taken place, and it would direct users to fuller resources. The pointer would be located in a catalog or other accessible guide to collections. It could consist of a very simple RDF statement about the type of documentation extant, ideally with connection to other metadata about the item itself. For instance, for libraries who use MARC records, this could be utilizing a 583 field for a note, a URL, or a URI. Potential use cases for this level of linking would be for legacy documentation, where retrospective modeling is not feasible, a placeholder insertion while fuller systems are developed, or situations where data is not open to the general public, but could be made available to internal staff, peer institutions, or vetted researchers. Level 2 involves selected data from documentation that is modeled to enable discovery and basic querying without having to do extensive modeling of non-structured data. The selected data could pull from structured data, such as bibliographic or catalog info, as well as a limited range of conservation information that is straightforward to model while being high-value information for limited groups or functions. Potential use cases in here would be treatment reports that include bibliographic data, limited item description, basic categories of treatment type, and materials information. Again, with information on how to access the full reports or full data. It would also work for semi-structured data, such as assessments that also include extensive notes fields. And finally, other types of conservation or preservation documentation that contains data that cannot yet be modeled, such as risk assessments. There are some areas we'll talk about to come where there are some challenges with modeling. And then the third level could be the whole deal. All data generated, modeled to the CDOC CRM ontology with full terminology references. And the potential use cases here are for documentation that consist exclusively of structured data. This could be information in databases, scientific data, form data that is already machine readable. It could also be documentation created in a collection management system or other system that supports linked data where modeling is built into the back end. So doing this modeling work, we also pointed out some broader issues for the ontology that we're using. And I'm gonna hand back over to Thanasis so he can talk about some of these issues we explored and discovered in our workshop.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And sorry, I hadn't muted. I mean, I only want to give a quick flavor of the kind of discussions we have. And this is the example that I brought earlier. So we said we can match that to the CDOC CRM classes and properties like this, human-made object and human-made feature. So this tells me that a book cover has a specific decoration, but what if I want to say that a book cover does not have decoration at all? You will notice that from talking about a specific decoration on the specific cover, now I'm talking about a type of thing that I can find on the cover. And there is no property in the CRM that will connect these two things. So as part of the discussion is to propose new properties, yeah, and say, okay, let's have a new property to say that any book cover or any man-made object, in fact, can bear a feature of type and then connect that to the generic idea of tool decoration. And then we can have an extra property to say, okay, so we have a book cover that does not bear a feature of type, will not have tool decoration. So it's trying to contribute to the CDOC CRM with information and case studies from the conservation field. We also discuss the best use of the existing abstract entities, the existing classes of the CRM. So for example, when we describe preservation condition, it seems that the E3 condition class that the CDOC CRM provides is probably good for generic statements about condition. But if we want to describe the appearance of the thing, then probably we need to define it as a E26 physical feature. And if we want more information about the process of deterioration, then we probably need classes like S18 alteration and physical genesis. We recognize that we are quite early in the process. I mean, we haven't really developed fully models about future work. So how do you describe a treatment proposal, work that will happen in the future? Or how do you describe the development of a treatment? You start with a plan, and as the treatment develops, you assess all the time and you change your plan a little bit. All that is useful information that at the moment we haven't got a model to describe. So for future work, we recognize we need to look at more conservation records, understand more about conservation documentation, and we're hoping to do that in collaboration with projects that have already a head start in modeling conservation data, like Amena, Parkour, and DISCO, all members of the consortium. But at this stage, I would like to pass the screen to Nicole, and Nicole will give us a quick introduction on some plans for the next phase of the project.
Okay, so so we were looking at some pilot data for looking at some data to model, and trying to think of the kind of applying this practically. What kind of research questions are we looking at, and what kind of research questions could we be asking, and what do we need to do to make the data sort of answer these questions? So we were looking, myself and Kristen and Elmer Usman from the Library of Congress were looking at research questions in book conservation. And we trying to find that some data that we have multiple institutions will have comparable data, so things on roughly the same kind of treatment that's useful, that we can interrogate to try and get some useful information for the field. And so we've picked book related questions because as libraries, that's kind of our thing. But of course this is the pilot, so it could apply to any kind of data from any specialism in whatever, paper conservation, textile conservation, architectural conservation, whatever. But I know about books, and that's where I can find data, so that's where we are at the moment. We looked for a sort of topic that has been going on for a long time, so that the data would be at least comparable over a period of time, maybe years, maybe even decades, because that will have more potential for the research questions to ask, and also something that we could compare across as wide a geographical range as possible. So thinking about what kind of data we wanted to choose as our pilot subject, we thought, well, how about mass desertification, for example? And that's something that we certainly have no information on that at the Bodleian. We haven't done that kind of thing. There's quite a lot in some US institutions, perhaps not elsewhere. It's quite hard to compare certain things, and other things like a technique that we might use in a very sort of limited number of institutions in parts of the UK that's just not relevant anywhere else. It's really hard to get meaningful research questions from that. So we were trying to look at something that's been going on for a long time across the world. And sorry, can you still hear me properly? Because my headphones are playing up a little bit.
Yes, no, you
can?
Yep. Clear. Yeah.
Yep, cool. So we looked at board reattachment. So board reattachment techniques, so that might be, it might be rebacking, or it might be, other ways of reattaching the boards to books where the boards have become detached. So these are the kind of questions. What's the history of board reattachment techniques over the past, let's say, 50 years? Can we identify periods that different repair materials were being used? How can these types of damage relate to other types of damage and types of repair, and what do we need to look at to answer questions about this? So, for example, anyone familiar with book conservation might understand this, and people who are not might not, but just for example, we've got lots of different types of board reattachment technique, and all of these are things that you would see in institutions in the US, in the UK, across Europe. Different, variations on these techniques that are vaguely comparable would be found in pretty much every library, private conservator, museum that has books would do these sorts of techniques. So rebacking, board slotting, board rehitching, the sort of Don Etherington hinge repair. And there are lots of variables about the materials that we use: leather, cloth, whether that's aerolinen, aerocotton, Japanese paper, thread rehitches, We've got the old school board slotting that was done in the sort of 80s and 90s using a big milling machine. We've got Jeff Peachy's sort of modernized version of that. We've got different institutions, schools, different sort of conservation departments that have taught certain things. So I know there was a Baudry Hitch technique that was taught sort of under Tony Keynes at Trinity College. There's the stuff that's been done in Texas. There's the New York thing. So there are sort of techniques that have been kind of favorites of certain teaching schools, certain tutors, certain groups. And I just put a link in there. I suspect it's probably not live, but anyway, when these procedures were done, there's a good review by Maria Fredericks on this particular thing in the Book and Paper Group Annual about Baudry attachment techniques, and we can look at sort of these sorts of reviews to see where were these things done, and then what kind of records do we have at the libraries that we're looking at, and how can we assess what kind of questions. So if we're asking how does a board slot using aerolinen, using the Jeff Peachy board slotting machine, how does that compare with a different kind? How can we find in the results of that? Can we look at our documentation and find, has this thing that we did in 1980, has that had to be repaired subsequently? What condition is it in now? Do we have recall records? That kind of thing. So how can we assess the impact and the results of that? And yeah, that's the stage we're at the moment, gathering some records together and trying to see if we can then model that data. So certainly at the Bodleian, our records at that stage are in sort of paper or card format, and various things at Stanford and Library of Congress. So we'll see how we get on with modeling those as we progress. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nicole.
No problem.
I just wanted to repeat what Nicole said, that yeah, this pilot is about book conservation, but clearly we're open to other pilots, and the techniques and method we're going to use is going to be identical for any other pilot or specialization. Now, I've noticed that the Q&A box is empty because Ryan has been very efficient with answering questions, but we are approaching the point in the webinar where we will be discussing questions. So now is the time to type your questions there if you have any. In the meantime, I wanted to also mention a couple of more things that we'll be trying to pursue in the next phase of the project. And another important task is working closely with the professional bodies represented in the consortium to draft a document which will be useful at departmental level and which will outline our vision for sharing conservation data in the long term. We are hoping that this document will be used to drive new projects with strong documentation aspects. We also plan to engage with museum educators to explore how the inherent cross-disciplinary nature of conservation can assist teaching at schools. And many thanks to Sarah Van Snick from the National Archives who helped us shape this, this idea. And finally, to say that we need to consider in the next phase of the project our relationship, the consortium's relationship with some great projects like Linked Art and Research Space that are again represented in the consortium. We want to use, I mean, these projects have done tons of work and we really want to use this work. The question is how we do that efficiently. So with this note, we would like to conclude the presentations for today. I'm going to turn off my screen sharing and look at the question box again. Also pass the microphone to Ryan, and if there are any questions, maybe Ryan can coordinate who answers what.
Okay, I haven't seen any new questions coming in. There was a considerable amount of interest in Eleni and Carrie's software and about whether or not tools were open source. So Carrie answered that his code is on GitHub. And if you have trouble finding that, I was able to find it by Google searching GitHub and C binding, and was able to find his repository that way. Or if you Google GitHub C binding and and the name, the metadata tool. And we are also looking into the Vista tool. That one is a little bit more complicated because people will need logins, but we'll follow up with that later. And Thanasis,
yeah, there's just one question that came up from Sarah, whether there is a sort of frequently asked questions for non-programmers, and this is a good point. Actually, I think Kristen is going to show the link for the website, and on the website we've got a special page with various resources, and they include 1-minute videos about linked data to publications, you know, many multi-page publications. So it's a range of things that you can look up online. But I think if there are no more questions, then maybe we can switch to Kristen now.
Yeah, let's do. Okay, so thank you, everybody. We'll wrap this up now. And I'd like to wrap up this morning with some thank yous. Thank you, everyone who's been viewing this webinar. We really appreciate your interest. We are extremely appreciative of the Arts and Humanities Research Council who funded this past year's work. We have been notified that our next proposal has been assessed favorably and still pending formal notification, but we're very excited about that. We would also like to thank the consortium members themselves. A full list is on our project website. They have been the foundation of all of our work by sharing their expertise, ideas, criticism, data, and interest. And then finally, we would like to share thanks to those in our home institutions who've helped us during the course of this year, particularly the recent work of Bridget Hart and today's technical assistance from Ryan Liu, who you've all heard guiding us through this webinar. In conclusion, please keep following our work, consider joining us, and help us move linked conservation data forward. We thank you for attending. And I think that's it for the morning. Thanks so much.